Hey everybody, my name is Damon Knight, and welcome back to my ever increasingly ongoing series of a complete noob's guide to astrophotography. As always, if you haven't yet, I do strongly recommend you go back and check out some of the previous videos. They lay a lot of kind of the foundational groundwork so that the stuff I'm talking about today hopefully makes a bit more sense. In today's video, we're going to be focusing on planetary astrophotography. Specifically, we're going to talk about the process of actually taking these pictures, and we'll talk a little bit about some, but only some, of the equipment and important things to know about that. Planetary astrophotography, as the name says, is all about taking pictures of planets in our solar system. One of the great things about taking pictures of the planets is how bright they are in the night sky. Why is this great? Well, it means that light pollution is really not a factor like it is if you're trying to take pictures of galaxies and nebula. So even if you live in a city, you can get some pretty amazing pictures of the planets. The brightness also means that you don't really need to worry so much about the speed of your telescope. Focal length, just magnification, is really the main consideration, along with aperture, and we'll talk a little bit more about both of those later in the video. Also, because planetary imaging session is much shorter than for galaxies and nebula, you don't really need the same sort of precise tracking, which means you can get away with a much simpler and generally less expensive mount. You also generally won't need filters, and your camera requirements are really just that it can take pictures really quickly. And I do mean really quickly. We'll go into some details in just a minute. Also, generally speaking, a smaller sensor is good for planetary as opposed to a bigger one. We're not going to talk much more about that though for this video. That's for another time. So, how does planetary astrophotography work? Well, the most common technique, the one we're going to talk about here, is what's called lucky imaging. The idea behind lucky imaging is you take a lot of pictures of your target very quickly. And like when I say a lot, I mean tens or even hundreds of pictures per second. Because you're taking so many, you're probably only going to be doing this for like a minute or two. There's some more reasons behind that, and we'll get to that. Then, once you have, this giant pile of probably thousands of pictures, you're going to use special software like PIP, to identify the best, sharpest of those pictures. And then you use some other software like AutoStackert or Registax, and you combine those best images into a final product. And usually there will be some sort of post-processing on the final image to adjust things like color balance and contrast, but we're not going to worry about that for this video. Even without post-processing, you can come up with some pretty cool pictures just from those stacks. So, why are you taking so many pictures so quickly? And it's actually kind of a complicated topic, but the simplified version is that the Earth's atmosphere is not perfectly transparent, and it's constantly shifting around and changing, even over fractions of a second. Since the planets are so small, getting any details to come out sharp is basically a matter of luck. Hence lucky imaging. So if you take thousands of pictures, you'll probably wind up with a whole bunch that came out reasonably well, and you toss out all the blurry ones. But before we move on, I do want to talk a little bit about why you're only taking pictures for such a relatively short amount of time. After all, right, wouldn't more be better? And theoretically, yes, right, more is better. But you have to remember that the planets are rotating just like the Earth does. Their moons might be rotating around them, and features like clouds and storms like on Jupiter are going to be moving around as well. So if you take pictures over too long of a period of time, those things are going to be moving in between some of your frames, and they'll be too different to get a good stack from. So that's very important to keep in mind. So now you have a basic idea of how planetary astrophotography actually works. We're going to try to wrap this video up talking a bit about telescopes. The biggest factors, like I mentioned before, for a telescope for planetary astrophotography are focal length and aperture. Again, focal length, basically just the amount of magnification. When it comes to planetary, more is better, all right? And as a general rule, anything below a focal length of like 500 millimeters is probably not going to be good for planetary. You can do it, but like you're just going to have a tiny little blob. It's just, you're not going to be able to see the cool details. That said, you know, uh, you still can see a planet, right? That's pretty cool. And honestly, you really want like 2,000 millimeters or more, uh, which is pretty long for kind of amateur astrophotography. But you can get telescopes, over 4,000. Um, Aperture again is kind of the other big consideration, and aperture really is just how big the opening of your telescope is on the front, the part that you're aiming at the planets. Um, when it comes to planetary, again, bigger is better, right? A wider aperture is going to let you get more detail out of the picture. It's not just going to make it bigger, it's going to add that detail. This is kind of why Newtonians and Dobsonians and even Schmidt-Cassegrain telescopes, SCTs, are very popular for this type of astrophotography. They tend to have much larger apertures than you're going to get from a refractor, like your telescope, like an apochromatic refractor telescope, or like a camera lens. So again, they'll let you get a lot more details. And you might say, well, Damon, long focal length telescopes for planetary are gigantic, right? Because, they're using reflectors and mirrors. They have really big mirrors. And getting longer focal lengths gets really, really expensive because those mirrors just get wider and wider and wider. And those mirrors cost a lot of money. You are absolutely right, but don't worry, you're not stuck. There is an item I'm going to just briefly talk about that will help you a lot. It's a piece of equipment called a Barlow. And a Barlow is something that generally sits between your telescope and your camera, and it uses lenses to increase the magnification of your telescope. It also slows it down, but for planetary, we don't care, that's fine. You can get Barlows that magnify anywhere from like 1.25 times your focal length up to 5 times your focal length. So, if you have a 500 millimeter focal length telescope and you put a 5x Barlow on it, you've now got a 2,500 millimeter focal length telescope. Super, super handy for planetary, and it's a whole lot cheaper than getting those big telescopes. A Barlow is usually a couple $100, where if you're talking about those really giant telescopes, you're getting into many thousands. So it can be a great cost-effective way to get that longer focal length for planetary. And that is about it for this video. Those were the absolute basics of planetary astrophotography. There are, of course, a whole bunch of other things that I've left out, like ADCs and whatnot, that we can talk about in a future video. But what you've learned here should be enough to hopefully get you started. Thank you so much, as always, for watching, and I hope to see you again next video, where we will probably be talking about deep space astrophotography, which is galaxies and nebula. Please make sure to check back in if that topic is of interest to you.